So let's get into our discussion. Both of your works deal with power and legacy, though in different ways. So Aaliyah, of course, your namesake, the book is about your namesake, your great-great-grandmother. And Juanita, your book touches on political themes, which is something that you do for work at MSNBC. I've seen some of your stuff, absolutely a fan. So could you tell us just a little bit about how you shape those personal connections with your book?
Yeah, I think what was shockingly personal about the story that I uncovered here was that had I not had a simple conversation with someone, it would have been lost to the archives. A simple conversation, and it was a surprise when it came up in an interview with then Congresswoman Barbara Lee, now Mayor of Oakland, and we were just talking about the 50th anniversary of Shirley Chisholm's presidential run. And she said, well, I'm the one who got the Black Panthers to support her campaign. I'm the one who took Huey P. Newton to Diane Carroll's house for a fundraiser. I said, wait a second. Wait a second. As the daughter of two people who love Diane Carroll, from Dynasty to A Different World and Claudine, I had multiple points of reference. And it was just confounding that in my follow-up interview with the Congresswoman, she said, you are the first journalist to ever request a follow-up conversation about this. I've been telling this story for years.
Oh my gosh.
And it felt like kind of the stories that are passed down through families. It felt like the same stories I would hear from my grandfather about his experiences that had national implications. And so that's what made this feel deeply, deeply personal for me.
I love that connection because sometimes I think that when you're thinking about just one time or one experience, you think it's a fleeting experience, but it lives on and some people remember, but it just takes someone to be interested in it. Absolutely. So tell us a little bit just about that power and legacy and that personal connection, Aaliyah.
So this book, Joy Goddess, Aaliyah Walker and the Harlem Renaissance, is the sort of the follow-up to my book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, my great-great-grandmother. And when I was writing that book, I knew that Aaliyah Walker needed her own story. So it's having a larger-than-life parent who's an icon, but how do you make your own way? But I really grew up much more interested in Aaliyah Walker, who Langston Hughes called the Joy Goddess of Harlem's 1920s, when I was a little girl and my mother and I would visit the apartment where her father lived. Her mother had died when she was a freshman at Howard, and so I would go into what had been my grandmother's bedroom and open the dresser drawer, and in that dresser drawer were things that had belonged to her and Madam Walker, an ostrich feather fan, mother of pearl opera glasses. But the thing that fascinated me the most as a little girl were these miniature mummy charms that opened up, a little sarcophagi inside. And I later in my research have found the receipt where Aaliyah Walker had bought those in Cairo in 1922. Wonderful. And then the silverware we used every day had Madam Walker's monogram. The baby grand piano in our living room on which I learned to read music had been in Aaliyah Walker's apartment in Harlem. And famous musicians had played because she knew all of the Harlem Renaissance cultural people. So I was interested in that. And then finally, when I was a senior in high school in 1970, the spring of 1970, I had to write a report. And I wrote a report about Aaliyah Walker and the Harlem Renaissance and her salon called the Dark Tower, because we had in our house the original invitation and menu, and then some of the books that had been at the Dark Tower, Langston Hughes's The Weary Blues and Countee Cullen's Color. So I was learning about them. Madam Walker, who I later would write a major biography about, was kind of intimidating to me as a young person. But Aaliyah Walker knew these writers who I was discovering and fascinated by.
I love that. I think a lot of times I read an article some years ago and it was called something similar to Don't Sell Your Grandmother's House.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just
that
about,
part.
Hello.
Yes.
It was just about preserving your history, preserving these things because they have implications later. I think with technology, a lot of times we take pictures of things, but I'm like, if there's an apocalypse, I would want to have these things physically in my hands. So that's just an idea of how having those physical items kind of spurred your inspiration to want to know more and to share that. So I think that's so important. I love that. So again, you brought to life before Madam C.J. Walker's story, but you had more of an effort regarding Aaliyah. Was it kind of more because you are her namesake in a
Well,
way.
there is
Did you feel a connection?
there's that part. I mean, Madam Walker, who of course had never had a major biography written about her, and it was really when I was in graduate school at Columbia, my advisor, Phyllis Garland, in the fall of 1975, the only Black woman on the faculty at that point, as we talked about my topic for my master's paper, and I was giving cliched, trite topics.
Okay.
And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is Alelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker?" And Alelia Walker. So I think Phil knew the answer. She had worked at Jet and Ebony. Her mother had been the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier. But I was not.
She planted a seed.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about that. But that really validated it for me. But Madam Walker obviously was the more substantial historical figure. And that allowed me to explore her beyond she's a woman who did hair. And to really look at her philanthropy and her political activism.
What do you think people most misunderstood about Alelia, and how did you use the book to kind of counteract those narratives?
So many people have written about the Harlem Renaissance. We're in the 100th anniversary of this major dinner where a lot of the young writers were celebrated. And some of the major biographies and histories about the Harlem Renaissance basically have written her off as a dilettante. Oh yes, her mother made the money, she spent the money. One really well-known historian whose work I really love, but who got her wrong, said she spent the 20s playing bridge. I mean, that was kind of just totally wrote her off. And I think women's stories during that era have not really been told well until the last couple of decades, as a lot of biographies are being written. So what I had to do was to take her beyond the caricature and show this multidimensional woman who truly was not just a person who hosted parties, but a convener and a catalyst for who brought a lot of people together, international friends, the cultural friends, the business people, the political people.
And Juanita, you touched on that a little bit in your book, just about Shirley Chisholm's journey and how she was seen being in Congress.
Right.
Could you tell us just a little bit about that, about the narrative of what she had to kind of fight to get through, and then show who she really was?
Well, honestly, the narrative was set while she was a New York State Assemblywoman. She was seen as disgruntled, angry, frustrated, one of the common tropes about Black women still today. And so she was facing an uphill battle the moment she entered the national stage. First as a candidate running against a Black male Republican who assumed the spot was his, or assumed that a man would get the spot of this newly created district in Brooklyn, New York. But Chisholm understood that the focus on men, the focus was ego-driven. She tapped into the power of women to organize and support her congressional run. And that's how she was able to get in. But again, that narrative of being angry followed her into Congress because she was given a committee assignment to agriculture and forestry. She said, "We ain't got no farms in Brooklyn. So what am I supposed to do with that? I'd rather be in a position to help my constituents." And she went to the House floor and demanded a new committee assignment. National press took that and ran with it. She's angry and yelling at these officials. She wasn't yelling at anyone. They were ignoring her until she was recognized. She stood there for hours waiting to be recognized. A voice wasn't raised, especially coming from her, but she stood firm. I think one of the moments that helped to challenge that narrative was a moment she had with David Frost, who, I love the tea and drama background. David Frost was dating Diane Carroll at the time of this party I write about. So they had this relationship that had started years before 1972 when he interviewed her in 1969. That interview was different because he asked her about who supports her. She talked about how her husband cares for her, how her husband is the one who noticed the tumor developing in her body when she was running for Congress, because she hadn't. She talked about her upbringing of rebellious efforts to play jazz piano instead of classical piano. And David Frost willed out a baby grand for her to play Tuxedo Junction, right, live on stage.
Amazing.
Through that one long-form interview, David Frost gave her the platform to speak for herself, emphasize her humanity, and show that to a national audience who only read negative headlines about her up to that point. And so the power of the media to reshape narratives, challenge them, and emphasize marginalized voices is critical. And that's something that I hope I was able to do through this form of media by writing about it.
I definitely think so because it gave me some things to think about. In the book, you dive into the role of Black women in shaping the Democratic Party. And how do you think this history informs where we are politically today?
How much time do we have? Y'all were here for the 2024 election. Y'all saw the exit poll numbers about how Black women overwhelmingly supported the first Black woman to earn the Democratic nomination for the presidency and the first Black woman to serve as vice president of this country. The effort and energy is there.
Yes.
And it has been there. And I love that there was space in the book for me to write about the efforts of the people who supported Chisholm unabashedly, like Fannie Lou Hamer, who absolutely stood firm and did not hedge like many of the other feminists of the moment did not say, I'm supporting McGovern because he's the best man in the Democratic primary, but also Chisholm. No, she said 100% here for Shirley Chisholm. Now, that energy was like a balm for Chisholm when she was trying to respond to a number of the fractures and fissures around her within her candidacy. But how it relates to today is, again, the steadfast commitment to action that is for the general well-being of the people is something that Black women have been doing
For a long time.
Come on. Come on.
For a long time.
And what I appreciate now, I get a lot of flack for saying this on air sometimes, is I appreciate that we're taking a break.
Okay.
I appreciate that there is this need to develop community in a different way for longevity at a moment when institutions are crumbling at a faster clip than ever.
Yes.
Because we have to be around to be able to do the work, and that requires us to prioritize our general well-being, and prioritize family, community, and each other. And I write about how sisterhood is a balm. It is a healing salve that is critical to our survival as individuals, but our collective survival and humanity. And so I think that absolutely came to fruition through this night that Diane Carroll hosted for Shirley Chisholm, because she saw power and possibility in what she was doing and challenging the notion of who's automatically deemed to be a leader, which again we saw in 2024.
Absolutely. Clap, clap. Both books highlight the often overlooked contributions, as we were just saying, of Black women. And so why do you think that more stories like these have to be told in this moment within our culture?
Well, just to pick up on what you're saying and to pick up on this, part of what A'Lelia Walker was doing in her convenings was bringing people together, giving them a space where they could be comfortable. And just for some context, once Madam Walker had become wealthy, she was headquartered in Indianapolis, and then A'Lelia persuaded her mother that they needed to have a presence in Harlem and bought a building, a townhouse in Harlem in 1913, then bought the building next door and had the building redesigned to include their salon and beauty school downstairs, but their living quarters. So this is now a grand mansion, essentially, in Harlem. Then when Madam Walker moves her personal residence from Indianapolis to New York, she has the same architect design a mansion for her outside of New York City in Westchester County. So now they have two beautiful homes where they always are entertaining. They're bringing together political people and cultural people, always with live music. And this is, as Harlem is becoming the Black cultural and political mecca. And the Great Migration, so people are coming to cities. So there's now a critical mass of educated Black people in these spaces. And they are creating spaces where they're founding the NAACP, where they're founding different institutions, where they're doing self-help within the community. And so there's all this other stuff that's going on outside the community. The Woodrow Wilson administration is resegregating. The federal government had not been segregated. People had low-level clerkship jobs, but they had jobs. But the Woodrow Wilson administration basically segregated the workplace and would not give new appointments to people who had had appointments in previous administrations. When the black soldiers who were fighting in World War I, 300,000 who went to France, who acquitted themselves well, came home thinking that they were going to be welcomed because of their service, instead were met by the Red Summer of 1919. And people here know about the Elaine, Arkansas massacre,
Yes.
and then the Tulsa massacre of 1921. So while we think of the Harlem Renaissance as parties and the Cotton Club and those kinds of things, some of those, that community building was happening internally because people needed it, but it was also a response to what was going on outside the community.
If I may add, I did appreciate so much how you wrote about how Madam directly challenged administration officials. She was hosting in her home to say, no, you need to talk about race issues right now during this war and the sacrifice that these men are making. And just confronting that in a space which wasn't hostile, but she still welcomed them with their divergent perspectives.
And literally, I'm glad you brought this. So when Madam Walker had the opening reception for Villa Lawaro, which is the home in Irvington, her guest of honor was Emmett Scott, who was the highest ranking black man in what was then called the War Department.
Which is now also called the War Department. Because
my
nothing's
friend
new.
Marshall is here. He knows about the War Department. But Emmett Scott was, because he worked in the Wilson administration, he had really been appointed because there was a lot of people in the black community were disgruntled because of the way the soldiers were being treated. But he was really there sort of as a proxy, but in some ways to tamp down the dissent. And so publicly, he was limited in what he could say. But Madam Walker wanted him to talk about what was going on. So yes, she was speaking truth to power.
I love that, the sense of community, because I work in community engagement, and I'm most at home wherever people are. I make myself at home wherever I go. So how important was that in both of these instances with something as wonderful as a Hollywood party, a soiree, but where these things were being talked about and support was trying to be garnered? How important was that? And then also with the salons, and when you have artists and people who needed support and could find patronage, how important is that sometimes with putting your dollars behind what you're talking about?
Because that's what it is. I started, I think it's chapter 2. I have little quotes that set the tone, and I said, "Cash rules everything around me." Wu-Tang Clan.
Yes, cream.
That's what it was. But the fact that Diahann Carroll had a Rolodex where she could call Flip Wilson, Berry Gordy, Goldie Hawn, David Frost, the list keeps going. She called these individuals together, some of whom Shirley Chisholm otherwise would not have had any access to. Because you got to keep in mind where Diahann Carroll was in 1972. Pre-Dynasty, but post-Julia. Julia was the iconic national sitcom, the first black woman to star in a national network sitcom. And that expanded her audience beyond who she was reaching as a Broadway star, beyond who she was reaching as a film star, beyond who she was reaching as a lounge and nightclub singer. So when she gave a quote to the LA Times that said, "Shirley Chisholm has ideas that can shape this nation," people are going to sit up and listen. And what Shirley Chisholm did in that moment was went person by person to engage with them, because she knew she had to make her pitch. She knew she had to make it worth their while. Now, I raise questions in the book about why someone like Berry Gordy, who has curated the soundtrack for many people's lives, but built a machine based on assimilation and white appeal, why would he hang out with Shirley Chisholm?
Yes, when their ideals were kind of different.
And she wasn't shrinking herself or modifying her posture for anyone. But that's the beauty of it, because they could have that conversation only with a setting that Diahann Carroll opened up. Now, the fun fact about the setting that Diahann Carroll opened up in this beautiful Benedict Canyon home with a cascading waterfall into the pool, it was built by the heiress of the Woolworth stores for her 21-year-old son decades before. Woolworth, yes, the site of the owners of the stores where the first sit-ins happened in
Wow.
Greensboro, North Carolina.
What a connection.
Jarring,
Right.
but beautiful that a Black superstar supporting the first Black woman to seek the Democratic nomination can have that setting.
Yeah.
So it's about not just who's there, but the significance of where they are.
Yes, and making a choice to support
Explicitly.
someone that you believe in, and like I said, put something behind it. And so I know that when they were throwing these soirees, I'm sure they were able to find patrons who were interested in supporting them, like Langston Hughes. I love the idea of the poem and how her nickname, the Joy Goddess, came about. Could you tell us a little bit about that connection?
Sure. So when Langston Hughes wrote his memoir, The Big C, he described some of A'Lelia Walker's parties and knowing her, and he calls her the Joy Goddess of Harlem's 1920s. Not just because of the parties, because some of these parties they weren't just like wild, crazy parties. There were concerts, there was classical music, there were poetry readings, there were receptions, but it was a place where people were welcome, and where some people who had money would have been very exclusive and they would have kept people out. She was very welcoming to a wide range of people. And as I say, it was international. She had traveled to Europe, Africa, and the Holy Land in 1921 and 22. So she expanded her circle of friends to have international friends. So when they would come to the US, or when their friends were coming to the US, they would say, look her up. So people were meeting a wide range of people. And she used that celebrity in some ways to attract other people. So if the congressman from Chicago, Oscar DePriest, was coming to New York, then his reception, his luncheon would be at the Dark Tower, at the Walker Studio in A'Lelia Walker's townhouse. So it became a space that everybody wanted to go to. If you were going to Harlem, you wanted your host to make sure that they took you to something there, because you would meet someone famous. Hers was not as much bringing other patrons in. If people met someone there, that was fine, but she wasn't necessarily saying, here's a set of patrons and here are a set of writers and you guys need to get together. But the atmosphere was such that people just made those friendships.
Organic connections, and it created an atmosphere where they were able to do that in an organic way. I absolutely love it. You guys really went deep into research, I'm guessing. So tell me how research played a big role in both. I know that you mentioned some things that you were inspired by, but I can only imagine that there had to be coverage. Was there news coverage or things like that, tabloids of the time, that you were able to dig in and kind of pull out some of those secrets?
Yeah. Would you like to go first?
Well, this is a long
Okay, I'll go first. Some of the research was delightful. Most of it was heartbreaking.
Oh, gosh.
Heartbreaking. I'm talking about, so the FBI has an online database called The Vault, where they have declassified records. One of those dossiers is on Huey P. Newton. Completely disorganized, so I literally have to go one page at a time. This took weeks. And then I get to the page where Huey P. Newton missed his first flight. This is his entourage. They are going to Diane Carroll's house for this fundraiser on this date. So on one hand, I'm like, yes, primary source confirmation, got it. He was there, like oh my God, they were following his every step. Wait, he was only 27 at the time? Like, oh, the stress, the strain, the fear, the mental and emotional toll. And that just kept happening again and again. A lot of the speeches that were recorded there were from the FBI archives. A lot of his conversations when he went on the David Frost show as well was cataloged there, because they were monitoring every step, every movement. And the fact that they did miss multiple flights that day in April 1972, the fact that they tracked him into the yellow cab, up to Diane Carroll's mansion, back to the airport, getting back home in Oakland at 2:15 the next morning.
Wow.
It put into perspective the amount of strain then and now. Like, because
And the amount of manpower they put in to do that.
Because this
at
is
that
a
time.
local, state, and federal collaboration. But it is also a reminder of how today, with the aid of technology and monitoring on phones, on laptops, you don't have to do anything physically. They are still able to. And so if that was the capability in April 27, 1972,
Imagine where we are now.
and it goes back to the theme of nothing is new. So that was some of the heartbreaking, but the fun stuff, tabloids, the mess, especially from some of the Black outlets. There was one column called Places and Situations. Ooh-wee. I found so much there. Confirmation that Flip Wilson gave a big check to Chisholm's campaign as soon as they walked in that door. Tabloid about Goldie Hawn being there without her husband. That's the only reason why I knew. They're like, where's Gus? She said, I don't know, and then carried on with her glass of champagne at Diane Carroll's home. Like, that was the most fun part of this, reading about Diane Carroll's relationship with David Frost and how their first date was effectively him interviewing her on their show. Like, it's just the dynamics at a human level. Like, you might scoff at tabloids today, but it was awfully fun reading through that for this book project.
And probably so much more special. I think now we look at celebrities and big figures. We see them all the time on social media. But I kind of miss the days where you had to physically read something and it was kind of curated and wasn't as much just, okay, I see them getting coffee. They seemed a little bit
And
more.
they have a whole reality show, right?
Yes, exactly.
So, so I'll start with the surveillance and then go to the great body of research that I had. One of the most interesting things for me as I was doing research for On Her Own Ground was finding that Madam Walker was spied upon by the Military Intelligence Division of the War Department during World War I because she'd been very outspoken on behalf of the Black soldiers. So she and Ida B. Wells were spied on, and they turn up in this report that calls them Negro subversives. Mainly because they were speaking out for civil rights. But that had been declassified. It made me, very proud of her actually to be on that list. But I was really blessed with a lot of material, a lot of primary sources. One of the brilliant things that Madam Walker did was to hire a really strong executive team, including an attorney and a secretary who saved their letters. And so we literally have 40,000 documents that have been digitized that are at the Indiana Historical Society. So she and her daughter were writing to their attorney almost every day for about a decade and a half. So I could sort of recreate where they were. In addition to that body of letters, I traveled to more than a dozen cities doing interviews with people, some of A'Lelia Walker's friends who were still living in the early 80s, Jimmy Daniels, who was a singer, who actually is from Arkansas, and Alberta Hunter, who was taking a nap at his apartment when I visited and invited me to come to the cookery where she was playing singing in Greenwich Village. So there was those personal interviews. Then other people's papers, Booker T. Washington's papers, Mary McLeod Bethune's papers, so I had that. And then A'Lelia Walker, during the 1920s, two of her best friends were society columnists for the Black newspapers. So where you were reading, what they did, what they drank, what they ate, Bessie Bearden, who's the mother of Romery Bearden, the famous artist, was at her parties. And then another woman who some people of a certain age would know as Jerry Major, who was the society columnist for Jet. In the 1920s, she had her own newspaper called The Tatler, as well as doing as well as doing these weekly columns. So I could see who was at the parties. And then I have, A'Lelia Walker's personal letters. So I really had too much material where many people don't have enough. So, and my grandfather, told stories. So I had a lot of
Oral
material.
history is so important.
Yeah.
What was something maybe that you ran across that you might could tell us that you did not include?
You know, there's not anything that I didn't include that I didn't want to tell. I mean, I was really very open, and as you know, from, you know, I wanted to show A'Lelia Walker as a, you know, a flaw, that her flaws
It
as
was
well as
very
her,
stripped
you know,
down.
right.
Yes.
But there were some things that got left out because the book was too long.
Oh,
Because-
how many pages
well,
was
it
your
was
original?
it was about double, but but I've been working. So unlike Juanita, who's fast, my book took a really long time. But over those many years and doing all this research, there were so many interesting people that I wanted to write about, and so they were her friends, and I would include, you know, 3 pages describing them. And my editor, when she did the final deep read, she said, you know, you have to really think about your reader, and you've gone off on a tangent. And I had gone off on tangents. I knew that I
put my
had
hands
gone
up,
off
I
on
did.
tangents. But for Jerry Major, Geraldine Dismond, there was a lot I wanted to say about her, but it did go off on a tangent. And so there were just things I had to leave out, some really interesting people. So one person who I thought was really interesting, a person named Turner Layton, who was a very accomplished musician, who was a good friend of A'Lelia Walker's, had a very interesting family background. His father had been director of music for the colored schools in Washington. He had worked on some of the early Black Broadway plays, but he and his wife moved to London in 1924 and basically lived in London. They would come back periodically. Well, I wanted to write about them coming back and the parties, but I couldn't pull the thread all the way through the book, so.
Absolutely. Well, I would be interested in an unabridged version.
Yes.
I think that's something you
Director's
might
cut.
should-
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So, Juanita, your book shows the deep strategic work in political organizing. What lessons from history do you think are most relevant to younger activists who are just getting started or who want to take up the mantle that they could learn from what Diana and Carol tried to extend for Shirley Chisholm?
I think first and foremost, reject every rule. The rules no longer apply. Create new ones. And in doing that, if you're not someone who's prepared or has the desire to be out front, be a first follower. Support early with resources, money, space, introductions, because that's what Diane Carroll truly did. She was, and I think it's important to understand the parallels between Diane Carroll and Shirley Chisholm. They are two badass women who carved through the steel of every ism, racism, sexism, like all of them. And she saw this kindred spirit in Shirley Chisholm because she was doing the same thing. Like Diane Carroll, for example, when it came to Dynasty, she told the producers, write this as a white man. I want you to disabuse yourself of any limitations you would place on me because I'm Black and a woman. I want to be the first rich Black bitch on television. That's a direct quote. So, and she was. And see that in parallel with Shirley Chisholm standing firm in the center of the House floor, not only demanding a new committee position, but there was another member who just couldn't accept that she earned the same congressional salary as him. He would say 42.5 every time she walked by, 42.5. And he would pretend to cough. He would pretend to cough, and then when she got towards her desk, he'd spit in his handkerchief at her.
Ooh.
So one day, she comes in, you know, she would wear her little sweater sets, and he's hacking and fake coughing, and she pulls out her handkerchief and spits towards him and said, I beat you to it today. Now, the entire galley is full of reporters every day in Congress. They burst out laughing. They're like, he got it today. Like, but what that tells me is you saw her abuse every single day. And wrote nothing about it, said nothing about it, just let it happen, just observed. And so when you're someone like that, it makes sense that Diane Carroll will see that similar spark within you. And so Diane Carroll being an early follower when Shirley Chisholm did not have the money that the other Democratic primary candidates had, did not have the national profile that they had, did not have the reach that they had. Not only did Diane Carroll open up her home, she put her name on the line in public in multiple press statements. I'm with Shirley Chisholm. I'm standing with her. Listen to her. Listen to her ideas, which had they come from a different messenger, maybe they would have been accepted. But some of those ideas were a national, federally subsidized network of child care centers. Like, can you imagine if that had been implemented in 1972? A basic family income, things people are still running on today. Like, that's the importance. So the first two things, and only two things, reject all the rules and be a first follower.
Yes, I love that. I think being sometimes people can get more centered on, well, it's just me. What can I do? But everyone has something to give.
Right.
And even if it's like you said at the time, a Rolodex
Right.
or someone to call on to make a connection, and just how important that was. Alelia, were there moments in Alilia's life that were difficult for you to write about and portray, especially with the family connection? And did you see some parallels in your own life and in some of the things that she went on? Because you did speak on some of the things that were really personal about her. Like I said, it was really stripped down and gave us an idea of who she was, just beyond the beautiful figure on the
Right,
cover.
right. Well, so I'm a journalist first. I mean, that is,
Okay.
that's my career. I
True
30,
and through.
30 years at NBC and ABC as a producer and then an executive. So I've approached things as a journalist, really wanting to tell a full story. And when I started doing this work in graduate school at Columbia, I went back to Indianapolis for the holidays, and my mother was in the hospital with lung cancer. And she was terminal, though at 23, that didn't totally compute with me. But I had a conversation with her. I said, I'm discovering as I'm doing this research, Madam Walker's not perfect. Now, I think that meant she'd been divorced a couple of times. I mean, whatever it was like, oh, what is this? But my mother said, I said, what do I do about this, Mommy? And she said, tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth. And that was one of our last conversations. And most people don't get that kind of gift. It's, don't tell that part about the family story, cover that up. But it was difficult to write about some of that mother-daughter dynamic. Now, I will say my mother was perfect. And somebody said, are you really? But no, seriously, I had a great relationship with my mother. Even she died early. But she was very supportive of me doing the things I wanted to do, not pressuring me about, going into the family business, be the journalist that you want to be. So I feel like she broke the cycle, in a sense. But Madam Walker was, she, as one of their secretaries said to me when I was interviewing her, she'd started working for them in 1916 when she was a teenager and was still working there in 1970, was my neighbor. And she was one of the people who gave me some insight. And I said, what was their relationship like? And she said, fire and ice. And then she I could tell she was, reflecting. And then she said, fire and ice. They loved each other dearly, and they sometimes fought fiercely. So they had a very entangled relationship, though they truly loved each other dearly. So there was a controlling aspect. Madam Walker, founder of the company, wanted things to go a certain way, was concerned about the men in Alelia Walker's life who she was going to marry, interfered with that. And then Alelia Walker actually adopted my grandmother. And that same dynamic played out with them, where she was interfering. And my grandmother's first husband was someone she didn't want to marry. It was really a disaster. So it was hard to write about that. And I never met my grandmother because, as I said, my grandmother died when my mother was a freshman in college in 1945. But because I have these letters, I can see that dynamic. I can see what was going on behind the scenes. And it was very hard to walk in my grandmother's shoes and see what she was going through.
And I think just because Madam C.J. Walker is such a powerful figure, I think to so many Black women, so it made me think about Alilia's connection with being an heiress and how much pressure there had to be that you have a parent who did all these great things, and with maybe an aspect of people thinking that now you were given something and that you were being frivolous with it when really it was yours to do
To do whatever you want. But yeah, I mean, and she, I describe her as the first Black celebrity heiress because there were other Black heiresses. There were other people. Mary Church Terrell, whose father was in Memphis, he was a millionaire. But she was more intellectual. She wasn't flamboyant about it. And she didn't really inherit it in the way that A'Lelia Walker did. But yes, people inevitably compared her to this larger than life figure. And she was trying to figure out how she could make her own way. And I think because both mother and daughter bonded over culture and theater and music and entertaining, that's where she found her entry point to express herself.
I love that. So I'll ask you both, as you were writing about these women whose stories challenge traditional narratives, how do you hope readers are changed after they engage with these?
Not necessarily changed, but inspired, and that is all one word: action.
Yes.
Action and community building, because at the core, one of the things that Shirley Chisholm centered in every day of her work was, this is about the people. So if you're not talking to me about bettering their lives, don't talk to me. Mm-hmm. And so action that's focused on people with recognition that we are the ones in control. Yes. Especially right now. Mm-hmm. Yes. Remembering that we are the ones in control is critical. Not one person in one building that's painted white, but us.
Yes, I think that's very prevalent for today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and so with the mother-daughter, with Madam Walker, where people think, oh, she's the millionaire. That's, I don't even really get into that conversation, but I know that's something that people think about. Mm-hmm. What matters to me is that she provided jobs and educational opportunity for thousands of women who otherwise would have been sharecroppers and domestics. She helped to create generational wealth. At her first convention in 1917, she gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products, but to the women who contributed the most to charity. She told them, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So you were supposed to use your economic power and independence to make a difference. So that, for me, is the message from Madam Walker. For A'Lelia Walker, as the heiress, she did not have the same engagement with politics that her mother had. But she did have a sense of how you bring people together so that they are in a space where they can interact with each other and make a difference.
And I think that even in that spirit, she left a legacy, because look at all the artists and people who came about in that whole era that we're still talking about today, and also Diane Carroll and Shirley Chisholm. So I think that is amazing. We are 15 minutes away from our session being over, and I would love to invite you guys to have time for questions, especially since we are talking about community and engaging with each other. Do not be shy. We have mics on either side. I ask that you come up really briefly if you have a question, and I think they might need to be turned on so we didn't get any feedback, but feel free to come up and ask a question. We would love to hear from you.
Good morning, and thank you for this beautiful conversation. I would like to ask both of you a question. There has been movies made on both of these women, and I'd like to ask a little bit of feedback from you about those movies. The first is Shirley, of course, starring Regina King, and the other one is Self-Made, starring Octavia Spencer. So if you all could just give us a little bit of feedback on what your thoughts are about those movies.
I'll be honest, I made it a point to not watch, especially through my writing process. Like, I submitted my manuscript in July of 2024. So even before Vice President Harris was stepped into the presidential run. But one thing a friend did share with me as she read the book, she was like, they didn't get a lot right in terms of dynamics between the human. She specifically pointed out the interaction between Huey P. Newton and Shirley Chisholm at the event, because the event was featured in this movie, as I'm told. But she said it seemed more like a negotiation, when the reality is the Black Panther said, we need somebody who's about the people, so we'll support her. And it wasn't a question, and it wasn't a negotiation. And in fact, Huey P. Newton and the Black Panthers had endorsed Shirley Chisholm before this event, 2 days before the event. The unfortunate reality is that the police had arranged to arrest Huey P. Newton at the endorsement event, so Bobby Seals read his statement there to the press with a member from Shirley Chisholm's campaign. The intention by law enforcement was to change the headline from Panthers endorse Shirley Chisholm to Panthers arrested while endorsing Shirley Chisholm. The former is what the headline that ran ultimately. But the intention was to create some sort of stain. So while I didn't watch, that was one point of feedback that I did get from a very close friend who had read my manuscript. Yeah.
Ah, self-made.
Oh, feelings.
I have spoken about this often and written about it as well. So my book, On Her Own Ground, was optioned, and I was excited when Octavia Spencer was attached to it. And I think Octavia did a great job. Blair Underwood is a really nice man, away from the screen.
Yes.
Lots of people worked really hard, the set designers, the hairstylists, the makeup people. So I try to give the props to the parts that were palatable. But I would, I'm choosing my words, aren't I?
Very measured, very measured.
But I, like Diane Carroll, I had some other thoughts. But here's what I will say, that I was hoping for Hidden Figures, and I feel like I got Real Housewives of Atlanta. So for those who like Real Housewives of Atlanta, great, but that's not what I wanted for this.
What we're going for.
And the showrunners, the people who managed the production, and the head writer, who were all Black women, really had a very different sensibility than I did. And so the way that these contracts work is that I had script review. So they had to show me the scripts beforehand. And so there were 4 episodes. They sent me the scripts. I had, as they say in Hollywood, lots of notes. So I expressed my unhappiness with some things. Some things got changed. It could have been worse. But what I really did not like, they decided, Madam Walker's competitor, Annie Malone, they were competitors. They were not friends. They were both really accomplished women who did a lot for other women. But to create this kind of trope of 2 women in a cat fight, they made their the conflict about skin color. It had nothing to do with that. They turned the other woman into a drug addict. Just like, how many cliches can we have? A'Lelia Walker did not have a girlfriend. The person who played the role was kind of the opposite of the real life A'Lelia Walker. As my grandfather described A'Lelia Walker, she was royal with royal instincts. Another person who said she didn't just walk into a room, she swept into a room. So that character was played as kind of a goofy person. And then Madam Walker's attorney, F.B. Ransom, who really kept the trains running on time in a sense, had taken an oath as a young man to never smoke, drink, or gamble. And yet they created a character who was supposedly his cousin, who was not just a numbers runner, but a pimp. So can we have more stereotypes?
Goodness.
And then had him bet on the numbers. So it was that kind of thing that was disappointing. And at the same time, I know that lots of people tell me they were inspired by it. They didn't notice the things that I'm pointing out. But I think when you present these stories about women and people of color when we are not usually portrayed, that's what a lot of people believe to be true.
Wow.
Yes. And I think that's
So-
very poignant.
I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Yes, sir. Hello. Welcome.
Good morning. I have 2 questions for Ms. Tolliver and Ms. Ballos. And Ms. Ballos, first question to you is, what do you think will represent the greatest challenges for you to sustain the legacy of this woman?
You know, I just feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. I mean, I think people wonder, like, why didn't you go into the family business? But both of my parents worked in hair care, but I wanted to be a journalist. And so I think by their encouragement for me to do the thing that I love doing, I have helped to tell the story. There would not be a Netflix series, there wouldn't be 5 books, there wouldn't be the speeches that I do and some of the work on the national historic landmarks if I had not put my energy into it. So I feel like for the last 50 years, I've really been doing that and keeping the legacy alive. And I'm particularly pleased that there are young scholars, especially, who have taken up some of that work. I try to leave detailed footnotes, endnotes at the end of my book so that other people who want to write in the future will be able to do it. So I'm not sure what more I could be doing, but I'm trying to do my best.
And you are. And you, Ms. Tolliver, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, don't you believe this nation has to undergo a healing process and really confront the issue of racism and color before we begin the process of really trying to have a great democracy? Thank you.
Yes, and. The and is this need to accept that there are problems by more than what we have, like a greater percentage of the population who recognizes those problems. Because what I've seen this year alone, the rejection, or even throughout the 2024 election, I was repeatedly asked, why do you think Vice President Harris isn't talking about being a Black woman more? I was like, do you see her? Genuinely, like, I would ask hosts, why is that so important to you? Of course, many of these hosts were white. Many of them were male. And so until there is an acceptance of the fact that, yes, this racism is a daily, prevalent, institutionalized, deeply seated issue in this country, then I don't think any healing can happen. But how do you confront that when truth is this distorted concept, or fact is a distorted concept now based on whatever personal opinion people hold in any moment? So what I fear is necessary is what we're witnessing. I don't know how far the collapse needs to go, but I know it's coming. And that's something that I spoke with you yesterday about in terms of media. Recently, I had a conversation with someone who said, are you afraid to go on air now? Are you afraid to say anything negative, for example, about the administration? I said, no, because what I say is rooted in fact, and I can point to the facts that are reported and confirmed. But would that stop any type of attack? No. I think the reality is I'm going to keep doing it until there is a point where it's not in my mental and emotional well-being to do it anymore. I think it goes back to what I said to one of your first questions about I'm glad to see people taking a break, because we've been talking about racism as a problem for decades and decades and decades and decades. But it's going to take a larger portion of the population in this country to wake up and accept what is before there can be any healing or any change. And I say that with an understanding of how racism influences the institutions that we live under today.
Can I just, add something to that? So, President Bill Clinton tried to have a conversation about race. John Hope Franklin was the chair of that. So it's not that we have not tried to have national conversations. There have been various points where those conversations happen. George Floyd in 2020 was a moment when lots of people were paying attention and sympathizing with this idea. But it is as if the compassion and empathy that came out of that created such a backlash to it that it's now we're not supposed to talk about it, or we're supposed to pretend that this doesn't exist. But it is in our face every single day. So it's not as if there's not conversation happening. It's that the blowback to that conversation happening is now on steroids.
Absolutely. Are there any more? Yes, sir, please.
This is for Lee.
Hi, Marshall. We went to elementary school together.
I love that.
Yeah, we started first grade in 1958
Yes, we did.
in Indianapolis. And Lily was
Come on, Lily.
was always an example of all the good things in life, all the way through school. When she was on the cutting edge of leadership, and by her example, she demonstrated a certain dignity and integrity that permeated our entire environment. I mean, we graduated from high school with over 1,000 people, fully integrated Jews, Catholics, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and all. And what do you think is the most important thing that you've contributed throughout all of this?
Well, thank you, Marshall. You know, I'm really lucky that I have wonderful parents who just encouraged me to do what I did, and who also were leaders, and so who modeled that for me. You know, I think that I'm lucky that I had the experience that we had such a varied group of folks that we could be friends with growing up, that we saw each other's humanity. And I think there are a lot of situations now where people they're in their silos. They don't interact with other people. They can see people only as demons and as the other. And I don't know how we fix that, because media, political figures are really feeding into that and stoking it. But we were very fortunate.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And that is right on time. We're going to give our authors a chance to have a short reprieve. Give them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
So much. I had an amazing time.